Welcome to Chapter 14 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, we'll be talking about stress. The coronavirus pandemic has really brought stress to the forefront of our minds. Stress is already such a huge part of our lives, but in this time where people are losing their jobs or having to relocate and work from home, stress has really come to the forefront. Some studies have shown that more than half of individuals who have lost their job or income are reporting really negative effects of stress on their mental health. Uh, and so it's important for us to be able to define what we mean by stress, because not all events that happen to us have the same kinds of effects on our physical and mental health. So when we say stress in psychology, we're talking about a process in which a person perceives and responds to events that they appraise as threatening to their well-being. So you'll find different definitions of stress in, say, engineering, where it has to do with forces, or different aspects of biology, or perhaps chemistry or physics. But here, when we're talking about stress in psychology, we're placing particular importance on the appraisal of situations, how we judge situations, how we interpret events that happen to us, and how we view them as either stressful or demanding, or as difficult for us to handle. So when we talk about appraisals, there's two kinds of appraisals, two basic kinds. There's primary appraisals and secondary appraisals. Primary appraisals are judgments about the degree of the potential harm or threat that a stressor poses to us. And then secondary appraisals are our judgments about how we can best cope with the stressor, or how effective our ability to cope with that stressor will be. Also, under primary appraisals, we often talk about threats and challenges that sometimes a stressor could be just a challenge for us. It could be something that we interpret as something that we have to overcome, or something we have to work towards. Or we can view stressors as threats, as things that are necessarily going to harm us or have negative consequences. So for example, graduating from college and entering the workforce could be viewed as a threat, because you are perhaps leaving your parents' home and losing some financial support and having to go off on your own. Or you could view it as a challenge. It's an opportunity for growth. And so when we engage in cognitive appraisals, when we start thinking about how stress will be a challenge or a threat to us, we see that stress has negative consequences, usually when we view our ability to cope with the stressor as poor, or we don't have any effective options for coping with that stressor. So for example, if you have an exam coming up, the exam would be the stressor. You go through a primary appraisal of, is this a challenge, or is this a threat? Is this an opportunity for growth, or is this going to harm me? If you view the exam as, okay, this is a challenge for me to show what I know and what I've learned so far, then that's helpful. That's a helpful kind of stress. Uh, Whereas if you view it as a threat, if I fail this exam, I'm going to be kicked out of this course, or I'm going to have to change majors, or I'll flunk out of college. That the negative consequences of that stressor would lead you to appraise the situation as a threat. And then the secondary appraisal is, how effectively can I cope with this? Well, this is a difficult exam and it's important for me to pass, otherwise I'll be kicked out of college. What are my options for preparing for that, for coping with that stressor? Well, it would be to study and prepare for the exam. So one might say that that is a low threat situation. Uh, to give another example, if you are a parent and you lose your child at the store, the primary appraisal would be that, oh no, my child could be lost or could be kidnapped. So that's a threat. And then you might feel like you don't have many options to effectively deal with that stressor. You might just be running around the store or calling out the child's name. Your strategies for solving or reducing that stress might not feel so good as, say, studying for an exam, which is like the clear solution. So without any clear solutions in that stressful scenario, that's when you might interpret it as a high threatening situation. So other terms that we often use when talking about stress are eustress and distress. So eustress is stress that can be positive or motivate us to do things in our best interest. And then distress is when you reach a stage of feeling burnt out or exhausted or overwhelmed to the point that there's a decline in your function. And we mentioned this kind of dose response curve in a previous video, that there's an optimal level of stress for most activities, that there's a certain degree of eustress where, if you're preparing for an exam, you need a deadline, or you need a date that's coming up so that you'll be motivated enough to study. But you don't want to be so stressed out that you can't properly take in information. Or so if you're studying at the last minute, or feeling unprepared the night before an exam, that would probably be past the optimal level of stress. So, health psychology is a subfield of psychology that is devoted to really understanding stress, the psychological influences on health, illness, and how basically how stress can literally result in physiological, biological, or other health consequences. So, health psychologists study the connection between stress and illness, why people make certain life choices. They design interventions to help people make more healthy choices, and also study the psychosocial aspects that contribute to health status. So the psychosocial aspects of recovering from cancer, or the psychosocial aspects of helping people's ability to recover from a brain injury, the non-biological factors in particular. What national surveys have found is that of the U.S. population in general, is that stress is typically higher in women than in men, as well as higher in those who are unemployed, those who have less education, those who have less income. And we also tend to see that people who are retired report the lowest levels of stress. So stress is not the same for everyone, is the take-home message, right? That different psychosocial aspects of people's lives can have an influence on the experience of stress. So, for example, if you take a look at this chart down here from comparing the years 1983, 2006 to 2009, individuals who are retired showed the least amount of stress in that time period, whereas people who's unemployed, it's much different. And if you look at the graphs in general from 1983 to 2009, stress is increasing. Stress is increasing in pretty significantly over this quarter century time span. So we've talked in a few videos about the fight or flight response, that in response to a threatening stressor, our body, our sympathetic nervous system activates different aspects of our body systems to help us respond to stress. So our pupils dilate, heart rate increases, perspiration increases. And all of these things are useful in the moment, but health psychologists essentially study how when the sympathetic nervous system is active for too long, or if someone is under a chronic amount of stress, that's when people start to experience difficulties with their health, and all kinds of chronic illnesses can be traced back to having too much stress. And underlying the stress response in the human body is something called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus, as well as the pituitary glands and the adrenal glands, work together to release hormones that enable the stress response. And when this system is active for too long, or is chronically activated with no homeostasis to bring it back down, that's when people start experiencing chronic health conditions. One of the key hormones that is released that we mentioned earlier this semester was cortisol. That's the commonly known as the stress hormone, which is released when we first encounter a stressor and prepares us to fight or to flee. And so, in the study of power posing, what was being talked about was that by adopting a strong pose for just a few minutes, people could reduce their level of cortisol. That was found in one study, was not replicated in many other studies, but just another way that we use biological markers of stress to help us improve or better cope with our stress responses.